welcome to the NC podcast. My name is Natasha Collins and I am the founder of NC Real Estate, which includes its members club for property investors to come and build a profitable property portfolio that completely aligns with their goals. I am so excited today because I have one of my favorite authors, because the book that I read this year has completely revolutionized my morning, which has revolutionized my day, and I cannot wait to introduce you and have this conversation. So for those of you who've seen all the posts, the blog posts that I put out as well about the book Rest, Why You Get More Done When You Work Less, I have got Alex Pang, who's authored this book, come to speak to me today. Hi Alex, how are you doing?
I'm just fine, Natasha. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, my absolute pleasure. I'm so excited to have you here. So you've just finished a book. Is this the one shorter, How Companies Are Redesigning the Workday and Reinventing the Future?
Exactly. So the new book is essentially about companies that are putting rest into practice by moving to 4-day work weeks or 6-hour days. And yeah, they're what's what I love about them is that they are, first of all, incredibly varied, right? I've
Mm-hmm.
got Michelin-starred restaurants, I have software startups, advertising agencies, or call centers, manufacturers. They're all over the world. Some of
Mm-hmm.
the biggest are in Korea and Japan, as well as Scandinavia or the UK or the US. And they are shortening their working hours. Right now without sacrificing people's salaries or cutting productivity or alienating clients. So I think it, it's they illustrate for us how it's possible to do this thing that seems impossible or science fictiony right now at
Mm-hmm.
incredibly low cost with great benefit. So it was that made it a fun book to write.
Amazing. And what are the key benefits that you've seen from 6 hour days, 4 days a week? Oh, wow, that's a
Right.
dream.
So, for organizations, most of them get into it out of a need to, it's about recruitment and retention for one thing.
Mm-hmm.
And, so this is why, restaurants do it, for example. They have tremendous issues with with retention. And then another one has to do, obviously, with work-life balance, with making it with attracting more experienced workers
Mm-hmm.
when you're a startup, let's say, um, and I think with uh, figuring out how to make companies or institutions more sustainable, right? Or if you want to build a company that doesn't just get, you know, sold in 3 years,
Mm-hmm.
but rather is like a place that you can imagine working for the next 30.
Yeah.
Um, you have to think about, or the work that you do as a marathon rather than a sprint. And, I think especially when you're in, let's say, software, or one of these other industries where long hours are the norm, where burnout is, virtually a public health crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Figuring out how to design your organization and design your workday so that you can do this work that you really love for a long time, rather than doing it to the point of self-destruction, is a real challenge.
Yeah.
And it's one that, I think that, as I talked about in Rest, there are various things that we can do as individuals to help reach to reach that state. But it's also really important to recognize that our ability to do that is shaped and constrained by the places where we work, by occupational and professional cultures, but also that those places and those cultures can be re-engineered um, to support that kind of better rested, more sustainable kind of work.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what the next book's about.
Fantastic. Oh, I'm so excited to read it. I cannot wait for that to come out.
You
Um,
know, I would love to have, an example of, a real estate management company or such to be able to throw in here. So, if you know of one who wants to give it a try, I'd be I would love to talk to them.
Okay, I think I know somebody. So can we talk a bit about rest, because this is the book that I've just finished, and as I said, I've made changes because of that, and it's just been great. I want to
Mhm.
start by asking what got you excited about studying rest and doing the research for rest? Why did you begin?
Well, I first started getting interested in the subject a few years ago when I was on a sabbatical at Microsoft Research in Cambridge, and I had been, for the previous 10 years, working in Silicon Valley as a technology forecaster and a consultant,
Mhm.
which is really, really interesting work. But it means always that you are at the beck and call of clients. It's a lot of travel. It's a lot of jumping from one project to another. And I think, like a lot of people, I was in that position of feeling increasingly stressed about a job that, under other circumstances, I would really love. Right?
Yeah.
It's work that has an awful lot of appeal about it, but was leading me to a point where I was going to burn out. So fortunately, I had this chance to sort of step back. I got this fellowship at Microsoft Research, and about a month into it, I was out one evening with my wife. We were sort of, we both had several books with us at this cafe, and I realized that I was getting enormous amounts of stuff done. I was having really great conversations. I was writing a lot, and but at the same time I didn't feel like like the constant time pressure that is a part of normal life in a place like Silicon Valley. And it
Mhm.
started me thinking that we think of overwork, of long hours, of that kind of time pressure, that stress, the risk of burnout, all as essentially prices that we have to pay in order to do really good work.
Yeah.
And this experience made me think maybe that's actually backwards.
Mhm.
Um, Maybe in order to do really great work, we have to um, figure out how we can build in more rest into our lives. And that started me looking at the lives of Nobel Prize winners and other super accomplished people for whom we have really good information about their day to day working lives.
Mhm.
Um, Also into research on the neuroscience of creativity, the psychology of creativity, that in recent years has, first off, helped us better understand the role that downtime plays in the creative process, and second, helped us look into the brain in those apparently idle moments when all of a sudden, you are in the shower, you're cleaning house, and all of a sudden you have this idea, an aha moment, a solution to a problem maybe that you were thinking about, or maybe a new approach that you can try.
Mhm.
And all of that stuff put together made me realize, sort of, that there actually is a really interesting story to be told here about the hidden role that rest plays in the lives of really creative people,
Mhm.
and that can be explained using this research. So, and it also, for me, offered um, a, a way to do good work, but also to balance that with rest in a way that seemed to me far better than the way I'd lived before. So that's the story.
Okay, so interesting. And so, did you start changing your routine first, or did you do the research and then change your routine? What does your daily routine look like now because of it?
Right. It is so the two of them kind of co-evolved.
Mhm.
I do pretty much everything that I talk about in the book. So, I think naps are a good example, right?
Yeah.
I think I started taking them before I got into the literature on naps, but the science of naps and the relationship between, like, naps and restoration and creativity certainly confirmed to me that this was something really, really worth doing.
Do you
And
do you nap at the
yeah, go ahead.
moment? You have that in your daily schedule?
It's not. it's not completely a daily thing. It's pretty close to it.
Wow.
But I certainly am willing to do it whenever I feel tired. When I get to that stage
Yeah.
where previously I would have had some more coffee. I'm the sort of person who, with practice, has learned to drop off for about 20 minutes, and a relatively short nap I find is restorative in a way that more caffeine is not necessarily. So, you know,
Okay.
naps are one thing that I do. Um, I think, like you, I have found that developing a good morning routine turns out to be a very powerful way of setting up the rest of the day, and of getting a lot done and having a sense of accomplishment much earlier in the day, which really kind of brightens up or brightens up everything. Um, and so, I've become more serious about exercise. I haven't had another sabbatical yet, which is one of the other things I talk about in the book.
Mhm.
But or I'm ever hopeful that someone will come through with, or with another offer. So, to the extent that I can do the things that I talk about in the book, I absolutely do them. And I think that the proof of their value is that it took me, what, like 10 years or so, to write my first book. And in the time since I've been doing all this stuff, the stuff that I talk about in Rest, I have written now 3 books in about 6 years.
Wow.
So, I am working better. I think I'm having better ideas.
Yeah.
And I certainly have a far better work-life balance than I ever did before.
And have you managed to set up your business in that time as well? Or have you always worked
Yeah,
for yourself as a consultant?
no, it's been a mix of sort of of uh, of working either for other people,
Yeah.
or uh, or of running running the restful company. So like I think like a lot of new ventures, it's one that sort of started out as more of a kind of sort of side gig or stage name,
Yeah.
um, and has become more of a thing over time. But um, however, you know, the however, all the books are ones that I've done while doing something else as well. And indeed, one of the reasons that, for plenty of us, morning routines are really important is that you got to go off to your day job. And so, the super early morning is the time when you can work on your own stuff. And so that's another reason why it really matters.
Yeah, I mean, definitely since reading your book, and I think I've raved about this as well, I realized how my daily routine just wasn't there. And if I moved everything to before 9 a.m., then that would give me the whole day to go out and do whatever I needed to do. So I was exercising at lunchtime, but it was just this thing in the middle of the day which would kind of catch me out because then it would take me ages to get back into the working routine. So I moved that to 6:30, and then after that I was like, right, in your gym clothes, just go out and take the dog for a walk. And that first 3 hours where I've been to the gym, I've then actually sat and had breakfast in between, and I read my emails and I just absorb what's going on. I don't reply to anything at that time in the morning. I'm just like, right, what do I need to think about that's going to happen for the rest of the day? Go out with the dog for 3 or 4 miles because otherwise she loves it, but otherwise she'll just run around like a crazy dog all day, which doesn't help me. And then I get started with my day once I'm back, and that has just changed how I feel because I know those first, and it takes me 3 hours to get that done. So that's from around waking up around 6 and then being at my desk by just after 9. That's 3 hours, which I completely appreciate that a lot of people listening to this may think, Natasha, I just don't have that, but it changes how I feel about the day. Can you give any practical tips to someone who has to get up and go and do that whole day at work? What could they do in their morning routine to get a bit of that or get all of that? In fact, I don't think you need it to be 3 hours. I just take my time.
Hmm. No, okay. So, first off, I think that it is important to recognize that we have a little more control over our time than we like to think. Sort of, I've been doing talks about rest all over the world.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I've noticed is that no matter where you are these days, if you ask someone how they're doing, the reply is, I'm so busy.
Yeah.
Right? And this is true. And I was in Azerbaijan last month. And you hear this there. You hear it in Amsterdam, Tokyo, New York, all over the place. And so, but I think that first off, recognizing that, while we are very accustomed to sort of this mode of busyness as a kind of way of life, I think that learning to recognize that of there we have a capacity to take back control of at least parts of our day, and to take it back from things like social media, from self-generated distractions. That
Hmm.
this is something that is, always within our grasp. Um, the second thing I would say is that even relatively small practices can make a big difference over time. So, I think that there are lots of people for whom, contemplative practices, whether it is, or of meditation, whether it's centering prayer, other things, um, you know, will report that these things don't necessarily take up a lot of your time, but they can set a tone for the rest of the morning and the rest of the day
Hmm.
that that delivers outsized value. Um, I think, and I mean, in a way, one of the things that I've discovered about rest is that it's that for really creative people, rest is pursued somewhat in the way that rest periods during high intensity exercise are pursued,
Hmm.
right? The or of you go all out and then you rest and then you go all out again, and the rest periods actually are really really important in those routines.
Hmm.
And for figures like scientists and composers and mathematicians, that ability to really dive into a problem, to work very intensively on it, is an incredibly valuable and often delightful and incredibly pleasurable thing. But that's not something that you can sustain for long periods. And the people who get really good at it recognize when they're no longer at their peak effectiveness. And at that point, they stop and they go do something else. And they recognize that, I'm going to be better off if I take a break now, I go do something else, rather than if I just kind of grind metal for the next several hours and not actually get anything done.
Hmm.
But I think it's also important to recognize that, you know, that our jobs, our careers, professions, professional norms, all of these put really significant constraints on how much and how seriously we're able to take rest and to bring it into our lives. It's not saying that it makes it completely impossible, but rather, I think we don't want to, you know, it is incorrect to see this simply as a matter of, of needing like better personal management, or to become better at self-care.
Hmm.
I think that, especially for, let's say, parents or for working women, the
Yeah.
assumption, they live in a world in which you're expected to parent as if you don't work and pursue your career as if you don't have children,
Yeah.
to do both of those at exactly the same time, and then to take the blame if you fail to live up to these impossibly high ideals in both domains. That's not something that uh, can be improved with tips and tricks,
No.
right? That requires a fundamental sort of a rethinking of the way that careers operate and
Yes.
or the professional norms. There are structural solutions to those problems that are that actually have been pioneered in the companies that I've been looking at for my latest book, that can be applied more broadly. So, I think that we need to take, it is it is always valuable for us to take our own time more seriously,
Yeah.
to recognize that rest in the context of periods of intensive focused activity can be both very restorative and can help us work better, but also to recognize that there are big structural issues that make it really hard for people, I think especially women,
Mhm.
to sort of do do work at the level that they want to do, um, while having the kinds of lives that we all want to have.
Yes, definitely. And it's something that is very much discussed. I know in the property industry, we're always having these conversations where I meet up with other surveyors or we speaking on the phone. And that's the one thing that is a massive problem is that if we if we leave work early or there's a need to go and collect your children or be involved in that, there's very much that stigma around, oh, they don't care enough. But
Right.
what have you experienced that can be done to change that?
So I think that part of what you're describing is something that sociologists call the flexibility stigma. And for a while, people have been interested in why it is that um, professional organizations will have flexible work programs, will
Yeah.
have like part-time programs for new parents, and people don't use them, right?
Hmm.
Something like 90% of law firms offer flexible work, and only 4% of people who are eligible actually take them.
Wow.
And this is a big frustration for everyone because it it means you lose people who could become great lawyers or accountants
Hmm.
or other professionals. It's costly for organizations because once that talent walks out the door, you've got to hire new people and you've got to retrain them.
Hmm.
um, and companies today face I was 20 years ago, companies hired 10% of their workers from the outside. These days, it's more than 60%. And so you've got the both the number of gaps that companies have to fill and the seniority at which they have to be filled is greater than ever. Um, but the problem is, and so while the flexible schedules look, they're are well intentioned, but the problem is that there is still the kind of cultural sensibility that people who are working flexibly are sort of they're taking advantage of the system, or they are creating more work for other people, or they are less reliable because they are not available 24/7,
Mm.
just in case someone has a question about something.
Mhm.
Whether it doesn't have to be an emergency
No.
any longer. It's just got to be, I feel like, what were those quarterly numbers from 2 years ago? And, I just kind of want to know. And, in an era when we can get like, DoorDash or of all the time, shouldn't we be able to get information all the time?
Yeah.
Um, and someone should be able to deliver this to us. And I think that and then on the other hand, people who work flexibly report feeling like they have to work they actually have to work harder
Mhm.
than they would in the office in order to deal with all that kind of coordination stuff that just happens normally when you're around other people. But also to make sure that their bosses know that they're not slacking off. And so it feels like a kind of lose lose proposition for everyone. And I think that while there are some organizations that have been better than others at at stating that of flexible work really genuinely is an option and that you can have a good career doing this. And they've been very mindful about trying to promote people who have been working part-time or making sure that they continue to get opportunities to work on interesting projects, that that for a lot of places this is a really hard thing. One of the things that I think places that go to 4-day work weeks or 6-hour days do right is that they give some of the benefits of flexible work to everybody.
Mhm.
So, for parents, being able to leave at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock is a, yeah, in time to pick up kids every day is an absolute game changer, right? I had someone say that, that um, they had, they now got to spend time with their kids before they got cranky at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Um, I assume they meant the kids rather than themselves, though. Now that, actually, I gotta go back and look at the transcript on that. But um, but to be able to spend time with the children before the kids have the meltdown is that's it. That sounds like a small thing, but if you're a parent, instantly that's actually a big thing.
Yeah.
And companies that make that reduce working time, reduce it for everybody. And so there is no stigma about leaving the office early when everyone is leaving the office early. And so I think that's, and that, you know places that have done this demonstrate that, with the right set of rules and with the right attitude, it's entirely possible to do, 5 days worth of work in 4 days,
Hmm.
or 40 hours worth of work in 30, and to do it in ways that help people be happier at work and to have more lives outside of work. So, I mean, I think that there are, I, this is not to say that we should give up on like flexible options, but I think that it is worth recognizing that that the costs. I think the costs of flexibility may be harder for some organizations to deal with than the costs of moving everyone to shorter hours, and that you may have happier outcomes doing the second rather than the first.
Yeah, I think definitely you've touched on some really key points. When I moved to America, with the university that I work at, I'm on a part-time contract, which is 21 hours, and I had to, when I was in the UK, I had to be going into the university at least 2 days a week, and I needed to be sat there 2 days a week. And then when we moved to America, and I said to them, look, I'm going to America, I'd still love to work with you, and they put me on that flexible contract. I remember the first couple of weeks that I was doing that flexible contract, and I'm now on a different time zone, so I'm not there when they're having their morning meetings or what have you, was so tough for me to get used to. And the fact that I was still working and doing as much as I did when I was in the office, but I couldn't always make the meetings to dial in, or sometimes the meetings just, there was no point. In fact, actually, what they realized was some of the meetings, there was no point me being there because they didn't need me anyway. But because I'd been in the office, they had to invite me. But it was that.
Of course, yes.
Yes. Anybody from the university that's listening, thank you for not including me in all of the meetings. I really appreciate that. It saves my time. But that it was the transition period that for me was really tough, because I always want to show that I'm working hard, that I'm doing what I say I'm doing. And now,
Hmm.
now that I've got that back into a routine, I feel completely good about it. I can pick it up and I can go out and have a walk. In fact, I've got walks scheduled into my calendar with the university. Like, the flexibility now is fantastic, and they just dropped everybody down, so the full-time contract is now 35 hours a week rather than 42, which is brilliant. But it's also that transition, and it's getting from, you go completely flexible and you think, oh my gosh, no one's here, I can't talk to anybody, or you can talk to people, they might not think you're doing anything, and then getting that routine in for yourself. And have you experienced that? Have you experienced people getting into their own routines, and why do you think that would be so beneficial?
You know, uh, that's a really interesting question. We think of routines as like, or of the enemy of creativity, and or the enemy of good ideas.
Yeah.
And I think they actually get a bad rap. What what well-designed routines do is is essentially kind of lay the table for innovation,
Yeah.
for insight and for creative thinking. Stephen King has a great line about this in his book about writing. And he says that, or of the idea that you get inspired, right? The muse throws the lightning bolt at you and you have this great idea, and then or you work in this creative frenzy um, is backwards.
Hmm.
That you know that's not that's not the way that Stephen King says he's written, what, 50 books now, or however many, just that astounding number. But rather, sort of, you start the work, and it's while you're working that you get inspired.
Yeah.
That, sort of dealing with with the technical issues of craft, sort of going back to this problem of, okay, how do you end this chapter? It's while you're struggling with that of the light bulb comes on. And
Hmm.
basically the muse needs to know where to find you in order to hit you with that jolt.
Hmm.
And I think or this is something that a lot of creative people discover, and that becomes a kind of centerpiece of how they work. The artist Chuck Close said that, or the muse exists, but it has to find you working. And so, I mean, the idea, this basic idea that you you get inspired by working.
Hmm.
You don't work after you are inspired, is, I think, a central discovery for lots of these folks. Now, why is this? I mean, now I think that some some indirect evidence that this is simply kind of how or of how the brain approaches problem solving, and that we have, in a sense, evolved to find creative solutions to very practical problems.
Hmm.
Right? Sort of, where is today's food? What can we use to build shelters? And that these are and that these are and that you know, for a long time, solutions to sort of solutions to problems were things that were incredibly specific and involved problems that were right in front of us.
Hmm.
Right? This was not about sort of how you sort of it wasn't about like abstract creative products. And so I think that you that there may be a kind of evolutionary argument for this, that for a long time human beings mainly were concerned with solving issues right in front of them to allow them to survive for another day, or for through the next season.
Hmm.
And so, or of the you know and so work work being the trigger for creativity under those circumstances makes total sense. um, and then, but I think that the other important thing that people like writers and composers tell us about this issue is that there's an awful lot of what we think of a lot of stuff in creative work that actually is pretty routine once you get good at it. So, Tchaikovsky has this line about going for long walks in the forest,
Hmm.
in the or of after he's been working in the morning. And he says, sometimes you come up with these great bridges between one movement and another, or between ways to connect these ideas. And sometimes you don't, and you just kind of write something that that just kind of makes it work, and and you just live with that, and you move on to the next thing. But I think that the point is that there is in every big project, whether it's a book or a symphony or something else,
Yeah.
there is plenty of work that is like more ordinary problem solving. And you can make a lot of progress on these big projects if you work diligently on that stuff, and sort of trust that the create that you know that the magic of the creative insight will hit at some point in the course of doing that work. It's certainly a much more reliable way of getting stuff done than waiting for the muse to strike and then starting to work, because that can be um, a scheduling disaster. So
So every project, then you schedule in a little bit of time just so that you know you're going to do it, and just give it a go. Just try it and work on it, bridge the gaps between where you are now to moving forward, and then from that you get inspired.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
No, and I think that I this is okay. I think there is biographical evidence that people also get better at working this way over time.
Hmm.
That lots of people who sing the praises of this kind of consistency have earlier in their lives periods where they like work in these self-destructive blazes of glory, or at least have really terrible time management skills, as I did in college and graduate school, right? I was one of these people who never started work before like until after David Letterman was over, partly because I was lousy at actually managing my time,
Yeah.
but also because I thought that's how creative people work, right? It's like
Yeah.
all stuff that happens in the middle of the night. And I think that and there are plenty of really famous people who become become the best versions of themselves when they learn to tame that and to take what looks like a sort of more kind of stable, almost sort of, boring bourgeois approach to their work, but which allows them actually to do their best work. And so, they kind of learn this the hard way.
Yeah.
Uh, that, that actually, you know, while it is kind of dramatic and in its way kind of fun, to do this work at the last moment in this kind of blaze of pressure, that really the odds of actually finishing it and of doing a good job are much better if you work in this more sustained way, and that you can and that over time, it seems like people who start to practice this actually get better at it. I mean, I think that you know I haven't I personally have not quantified this or tried to mark the number of times that this happens, in a month of writing. But I do think that I have more of those experiences of, switching on the light at 5 in the morning and starting to write and having some really, really good idea in that kind of semi-conscious phase where I'm operating a little bit on automatic as I write,
Hmm.
and I have some insight that I seriously doubt I would have any other time of day. But I think that I have more of those things now than I did 6 years ago when I started working in this manner. And from what I can tell, other people report similar things. That this is, it's a practice that improves over time. It's not like a one-time thing where you switch your calendar and sort of the ideas just switch, and the ideas just like switch on. It's not like, sort of it's not like starting an oil well, right?
Yeah.
You drill once and then you get the oil forever. This is more like, farming or fishing. It's about, it's about developing a relationship with this time that allows you to work better for a long time.
It's really interesting. So you have to develop that skill, and then I want to tie this in with a question that I've been asked from some of my colleagues who are looking at writing books or doing their PhDs. And would you,
Hmm.
so as well as that, how would you fit in that extra project? You tie that in with maybe starting and doing it for an hour and your creativity comes, rather than having to know everything about the topic before you start. You kind of just start going at an angle.
Hmm. Well, I think that the of that you are that it is. Let me think about this for a second. I mean, um, for me, the like that period the early in the early morning
Hmm.
when I'm working well is I've got to have something that I'm working on, in order for that period to be super useful.
Yeah.
Like when I'm just thinking about the 4 Day Week book. It was uh, I don't get I don't get up super early to think about new ideas. I mean, to, or of
Hmm.
when they're in the very early stages, and I'm trying to figure out like what's the angle here? Is there a story here or not? Is there enough material? That kind of calculation is not stuff that happens between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m.
Okay.
The actual like writing of a book is what happens then, and and it's or if it's a and so for me that really early morning is a period in which I can be inspired about something that I'm sort of that I'm already certain is worth working on. It's already something whose contours you know, I have mapped out, and it's really about working through the million and one details.
Hmm.
So, I think that sort of for let's say for a graduate student or someone who is, let's say, pursuing a degree while working.
Yep.
I think that at a practical level, it may be that you know the more or the I think the morning is never a bad time to get stuff done. It's just a question of how you design your routine
Yep.
and what it is that what it is that you choose to work on. And certainly, I mean, for me, like the period between 5 a.m. and 7 a.m. when I'm writing is a period is that's like okay, I'm not a morning person. I have never been a morning person. Getting up at 5 is a real sacrifice for me,
Wow. Yeah, I'm not a
but
morning person.
the reason that I do it, the reason that those hours are super valuable is that or if I'm not quite awake, and so it's almost like the door to the creative subconscious is still a little bit ajar because I'm not yet fully conscious.
Hmm.
And the routine that I have developed for writing in that period is one that is designed to minimize the number of distractions that I have, the number of decisions that I have to make in that period. It essentially allows me to stay in that state for as long as I can, but just sitting in front of the keyboard rather than in bed.
Hmm.
And, I think that you know, there is something about that time of day that actually genuinely is special. There's a reason that, Buddhist monks or, sort of or in Benedictine monasteries, you're getting up at 4 or 5 a.m. In order to chant an hour of prayers.
Yep.
There is something about that time that is unusual for most people, and so for me, that period is designed in order to allow that part of my creative mind sort of an opportunity to sort of express itself and to get out some words that my conscious self would have real trouble formulating. After that, I become closer to, sort of the more normal, rational thinking person.
Hmm.
And so yeah, I think that if I were still in school, those first couple hours of writing would still be really valuable. But then after that, it might be that dealing with coursework and more normal kinds of things would be what I would shift into. And indeed, and in fact, when I'm writing, it's often like the second half of the morning when I'm doing when I'm doing stuff that doesn't require quite as much like creative energy, but is more sort of thinking about organizational stuff or like writing up stories. Um, and is, requires good craft and attention to detail and so on, but doesn't necessarily require the same level of like intense creative fire that some other parts of any book do.
Hmm. It's really interesting. So, do you think that this? I mean, you said we looking at the 6 hour working day and 4 hour working week. Do you
Hmm.
think that our working lives in the future will change to take into account the times of the day when we're really in the flow, or the times of the day where we're feeling a little bit more that we have to go out and do an activity? Do you think that our working lives will start revolving more around that?
The answer is the companies that are doing this absolutely pay more attention to those things. That
Okay.
one of the things, yeah. So um, at least sort of uh, creative firms are already, yeah, are doing this. So what they will do is they'll redesign the workday so that the usually the first several hours of the day, the morning is reserved for people's most intensive, most challenging work. It's also the case that generally, and what that means is number one, absolutely no meetings. You might have like a 5 minute stand up meeting, but that's just to just to do some really quick coordination.
Hmm.
But that the hour long meeting that starts at 9 a.m. and basically destroys the rest
Mm,
of your day, nobody does this.
good.
Absolutely nobody does this. So quick stand up meeting, and then the next couple hours are you work on whatever is most critical. The office generally is quiet.
Hmm.
You also have the right to tell people to buzz off. You don't have to answer the phones. You don't deal with email. You just have permission to work on your most important stuff.
Yeah.
And then the day kind of eases up after that. You hold meetings in the afternoon. Maybe you've got a particular block of time for sort of clients. You've got another block of time for more internal kinds of things. But it's definitely the case that one of the things that these companies do is recognize that we are better at some kinds of tasks at one time of day and better at other kinds of tasks at another time of day, and they match those tasks to those times.
Hmm.
The way that far too many offices work today is they assume that you're that every moment between 9 and 5 is like the same. It's
Yeah.
just like sort of in a factory, right? It doesn't
Yeah.
matter if you're making widgets at 9:01 or 4:59. You're still doing the same set of things with your hands.
Yeah.
But you know, cognitive work doesn't work that way, right? Brainstorming at 9 o'clock, brainstorming at 4 o'clock are actually pretty different kinds of activities. Um, our attention levels vary throughout the day, which is why the last thing you ever want to do is be in um, a meeting after lunch.
Hmm.
And I think that one of the keys for the companies that have moved to shorter days is recognizing that you can really get a big boost and you can recover some of the productivity that you might otherwise lose by shortening the work week, by paying more attention to designing the day to synchronize activities with sort of with circadian rhythms and cognitive abilities.
Hmm.
So that's absolutely something that they are already doing with clear benefit.
And how do we, the people who work in companies who don't yet do that, how could we start to approach our employers and asking them about this, or showing them the research and saying perhaps we'll look at moving towards this, or what could be a small step that we could just ask the question?
Well, I think that sort of in a sense, or to some degree, you just answered the question, right? I mean, that there's this body of research that sort of demonstrates the benefits of this. There are places that already are doing it, but I think that arguably, for one of the things that you might do is, I think starting with meetings is actually a really good way to begin trying to nudge a department or a company down this path.
Hmm.
Nobody likes meetings, right?
Yeah.
Everybody and I think that sort of learning to practice the discipline of making meetings shorter, of
Hmm.
thinking about what times of day meetings can best be held or are kind of most damaging to people's productivity, that that is almost the easiest win that you could have in a kind of secret campaign to shorten the workday. And I mean, I think that it illustrates how, by thinking a little bit more about process, I think about who actually needs to be in the meeting, um, what things need to be done here, how quickly can you get through them. Those are all good things that should happen in any meeting anyway. And
Hmm.
then thinking about when during the day the meeting can happen, sort of begins to clue you into the fact that you can sync that there's a big gain to be had by synchronizing organizational activities to circadian rhythms. Um, that that maybe is a way of show of first showing these benefits, and then after a month or two, pointing out that, okay, this is it turns out there are other things that we can do like this that are also really good, which, for example, doing similar kinds of things around email and other kinds of technology use. And that, ultimately, it turns out, companies that do this are able to become so much more productive that they get all their work done at the end of Thursday, and they just, and everybody now has a 3-day weekend every week.
Hmm.
Um, I think that, so far, the organizations that have done this have done it. It's been sparked from the top down. Um, these have generally been either relatively small organizations or big companies that still have the original founders in charge. And so, these charismatic figures who are able to take a 2,000 person company and say, we're going to go in this direction, and the company actually will still do it.
Hmm.
And but the actual work of figuring out how to implement this, about how to do 5 days worth of work in 4 days, is something that happens from the bottom up.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I think that it's difficult to imagine a scenario under which you didn't have the boss saying, "Okay, we're going to try and do this," and having them do it often for quite personal reasons, right?
Yeah.
They want to have more time with their family. They want to have, the various things that all of us, it turns out, actually want to have.
Yeah.
Um, and but I think that they're sort of that starting with things like better meeting practices may be a way of sort of starting to nudge open that door, so that before too long, um, the boss can see, hey, there's this door here, maybe we ought to walk through
Yeah.
it. And sort of essentially give and then providing the organizational and managerial permission to take the more radical step of actually formally shortening the workday.
Yes. Yes, that's such good advice. Okay, so final question. If you could encourage my audience to incorporate rest into their daily lives by making one small change, what would it be?
I suppose the one small change would be sleep more, which sounds, which is both incredibly simple and harder than it looks. I
Hmm.
mean, incredibly simple in that we all know how to sleep, but if you can, I think that, um, of all the things that I talk about in the book, sleep arguably is the most valuable,
Yeah.
both in the short term and in the long term. In terms of the effect on mood, the effect on our overall emotional states, on our honesty at work. People who are sleep deprived are more likely to cheat if
Hmm.
they think they're not going to get caught. Um, we work better. We're better people when we're better rested. And I think that sort of taking sleep more seriously is like the gateway drug for sort of for taking other kinds of rest more seriously. So whether that is sleeping, whether that's sleeping better at night, sleeping longer at night, or whether it's being able to work in a nap during the day. Um, I think that's the single most valuable thing that you can do for sort of for yourself as a person, as a professional, as a
Hmm.
parent, um, and sort of and it will be, it's less likely to be the last thing that you do along this road than the first thing.
Hmm. We need to take that on board. So everybody that's listening, please, if you can, take on that more sleep because you'll get more out of your day and you'll be far more productive. And that's what we're all after. Because if we want to be fitting in everything that we've got to do, almost we need to be working smarter, resting longer, and you'll get to where you need to be. Would that be the key takeaway?
Exactly. Yes.
Amazing.
Very
Alex,
well said.
thank you so much for coming on my podcast today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. This is always a pleasure to talk about this stuff, Natasha.
Amazing. Thank you, everybody who came and listened to this today. We really appreciate it. If you want to find out more about Alex, I'm going to put his bio and all of his social media and contact details below so you can go and have a look. And also, if you want to come over and want to check out my website, head on over to www.ncrealestate.co.uk. Thank you for joining us today. I cannot wait to catch up with you again soon.